Years ago, I was sitting on a train, and it was quiet, fairly empty. And then at this one stop, a bunch of people got on, and as they were all inching towards their seats, I glanced up and did a double take and exclaimed, "You're Dr. Villainer S. Ramachandran." And the guy was like, yes, I am. He seemed a little bit surprised to be recognized. This was probably before he had spoken at TED and published bestsellers and been featured in documentaries. I had stumbled across his work due to a BBC radio lecture series a few years prior. Dr. Ramachandran is a neuroscientist, and I think he asked me if I was a student at the university where he does research. And I'm like, no, I'm a programmer. And then I blurted out, I live with a synesthete. And then the encounter was over. This is somewhat less of a non sequitur than it perhaps sounds like. Ramachandran did groundbreaking work on synesthesia, which is a little bit of neural cross-wiring. For someone with synesthesia, a sensory receptor will be activated, the signal will travel to the brain where it triggers a sensory perception, and there, it will bleed over into a nearby part of the brain, triggering a secondary perception. So they might activate a pain receptor and feel pain, and it might also cause them to hear a certain tone, or they'll hear a sound, and it might have a visual texture or have some particular taste. One of my classmates at university used to organize everything on her desk in pairs because 2 is such a cheerful, cuddly number. 3, on the other hand, was positively dreary. She didn't like 3 at all. This secondary layer of perception is incredibly stable over time, and some people with synesthesia can use this extra layer of perception to help orient themselves. One woman I read about knew that it's time to see the dentist when her toothache turns orange. There's an Australian opera singer whose synesthesia gives her an extraordinarily detailed memory for sounds. Her name is Priscilla Dunstan. And a few years ago, Dunstan had a baby. Those first few weeks and months can be incredibly tough. You're hopelessly sleep-deprived. The baby cries. You have no idea how to fix it. You feel helpless and isolated. And people promise parents that they will start to recognize the different cries. And Dunstan, despite her extraordinary memory for sounds, wasn't hearing it. And finally, one desperate morning, she started keeping a log of all of her baby's cries and crying sounds. And slowly, she came to the realization that there was no distinction. A cry was just a cry. But there were specific sounds that happened at the very beginning of a cry. And as she listened and experimented, that pre-cry fussiness became more and more distinct. "I'm hungry" was very different from "I have gastrointestinal discomfort." And in time, she reliably assigned distinct meanings to 5 different pre-cry sounds that her son made. Eventually, she started getting out of the house more, where other babies were hungry and tired and needed to be burped, and to her astonishment, they seemed to be expressing this in ways that were remarkably similar. She was hearing it, and others were not. When we talk about expertise and mastery, we tend to talk about knowing facts and being able to explicitly verbalize concepts and execute specific sequences of steps. One of the characters in the Kingkiller Chronicles observes that playing music is a lot like telling a joke. Anyone can remember the words, anyone can repeat it, but making someone laugh requires more than that. Telling a joke faster doesn't make it funnier. An expert isn't just a faster novice. Experts seem to have this magical thing. We call it insight, judgment, intuition, brilliance. And they got that way because of some unarticulated range of experiences, practice perhaps, or seasoning, the enigmatic passage of time. In an experiment, researchers gave terrain analysts 2 minutes to look at an aerial photograph. And 2 minutes is not a lot. It typically takes hours to do an analysis. After 2 minutes, one of the engineers started his debrief with an offhand comment that whoever got sent to the area needed to be prepared for certain types of bacterial infections. And the researcher was like, wait, what? You can see bacteria on a picture taken from 40,000 feet? And the engineer was like, well, the photo showed a tropical climate, and the vegetation was mature and uniform, so the contour to the top of the tree canopy could be taken as a reflection of the underlying soil. And since the soil layer would be relatively thin, the contour to the tree canopy reflected the underlying bedrock, which appeared to be tilted interbedded limestone, and the bedrock determined the pattern to the streams and the ponds, and there appeared to be a pond that didn't have a major distributary running away from it. So given the climate and the vegetation and the stagnant water, the presence of bacteria was a sure bet. Experts have a hard time explaining what they do or how they know. They just know. Their skill is consistent and reliable and kind of mysterious. So if you can't explain it and you don't even necessarily know what it is, how do you teach it? How do you teach seasoning and perspicacity and judgment? How do you teach intuition? In Japan, at the turn of the previous century, there were people who could look at a day-old chick and determine whether it was male or female. Now, this might seem neither important nor particularly impressive, but it led to massive price reductions worldwide, because unless you are an expert chick sexer, you will feed a baby chicken for 6 weeks before you can reliably tell if it's a boy chicken or a girl chicken. And cockerels are of no use to the poultry industry because not only do they not lay eggs, but typically they're also smaller, their meat is stringier, and I'm told they are troublemakers. So this gets expensive at an industrial scale. So the Japanese founded a school in the 1920s to train new chick sexers. The thing is, most of the time, chick sexers literally cannot tell you how they know. Most of the time, they are incapable of pointing out any particular diagnostic structure that they rely on to make the determination. So the training consisted of pairing a novice up with an expert and having the novice guess, male or female. And the expert would tell them yes or no for 2 years. After that point, the newly graduated chick sexers were sexing up to 1,200 chicks per hour with an accuracy rate of 97%, all without being able to tell you how they know. Now, traditionally, we are really good at training the deliberate part of the brain. We write tutorials and coursework, we devise drills and practice problems, we assign homework. We are not so good at training the automatic part of the brain. We're exposed to all of these chaotic signals our whole lives. And the brain just kind of picks through it and figures stuff out. And it turns out there's an entire field of psychology dedicated to understanding the conditions under which the brain figures this stuff out. And it all started in the 1960s with a researcher named Eleanor Gibson. She designed a delightful experiment that unambiguously illustrated the fundamental building blocks of our ability to develop accurate snap judgments. And she'd start by showing a research subject a completely meaningless squiggle. And then she explained that she would show them a series of squiggles, and would they please identify every single squiggle that matched this reference squiggle exactly. And then she would flip through them one by one, and the research subject would make their guesses. And she didn't give them any feedback at all. And after they'd gotten through the entire deck, she would start over. This is the reference squiggle. Please identify all of the squiggles that match. Still no feedback. By the third time through, the research subject would have correctly identified every single target squiggle. Their brain was discovering different, meaningful squiggle dimensions. As they were shown the squiggles, they'd suddenly notice that some squiggles went one way, whereas others went the other way. A squiggle might have 3 or 4 or 5 spirals, and the overall shape of the squiggle varied. Some were round and some were kind of squished. Our brains are constantly going through this process of differentiation, figuring out which characteristics matter and which don't. And as the brain discovers which dimensions are important, it starts paying closer attention to those dimensions, and we start making finer discriminations. Our perceptual resolution increases. Photographers gain a richer experience of light. Musicians gain a richer experience of sound. Industrial tasters learn to differentiate mayonnaise along 14 different dimensions of flavor. And this field of study is called perceptual learning. It explores the specific ways in which the perception of experts differs from that of novices. There is a fundamental difference between how the brains of novices and experts extract information. For example, novice drummers sight-read rhythms note by note. They think about rhythms in terms of how long each note lasts. Experienced drummers don't read note for note, they read beat for beat. Each beat has a distinct rhythmic figure, and they think about that figure as one coherent idea. And there aren't that many different rhythmic configurations that typically occur on a single beat, so over time, drummers begin to recognize these figures at a glance. Novices see lots of low-level pieces of data, whereas experts see chunks and higher-order relations. When navigating an unfamiliar public transit system, we look at every surface, every sign, every arrow, every blinky light. We carefully parse and analyze. For good measure, we cross our fingers, and we still manage to take the right train in the wrong direction, or get off at the wrong stop, or exit on the northeast side of the station rather than the southwest side of the station. Over time, as we get used to traveling in the city, our brains start attenuating a lot of the irrelevant signs and signals, and automatically focuses in on the few cues that happen to matter. Novices pay attention to both relevant and irrelevant data. They can't help themselves. Experts often don't even notice irrelevant data. Right? They also can't help themselves. As we gain expertise, our brains amplify relevant characteristics and attenuate or even filter out irrelevant ones. And all of this happens before the signals reach the part of the brain where we're aware of perceiving things. So both units and selectivity are about how we extract information. Another stark difference between novices and experts is how efficiently they extract information. Experienced pilots determine our aircraft attitude and situation with a bare glance at their instrument panels. And inexperienced pilots, on the other hand, they read and cross-check their instruments very carefully, one instrument at a time. Novices process things serially, whereas experts have a much greater tendency to process things in parallel. And also, novices process slowly, whereas experts process more quickly. And finally, whether sight reading drum notation or navigating a public transit system or cross-checking aircraft instrument panels, novices are going to be drained after doing it. And for experts, the effort will hardly register at all. So that's basic science. Discovery effects are about how we extract information. It's about patterns and filtering incoming signals. Fluency effects are about how efficiently we extract information. And the reasoning of novices is slow, serial, capacity constrained, whereas the perceptual processes of experts are fast and parallel, and they don't drain cognitive resources. Where this gets interesting is when you take these basic ideas and figure out how to use them to explicitly train intuition. And there's a cognitive scientist named Philip Kalman who has spent the past 30 or so years exploring this question. And one of the things that's so fascinating about Kalman's work is he's not going to invite you into his research lab and train you to intuitively be better at differentiating the angle of lines on a computer screen. He picks complex, real-world problems to study. Now, some of his early stuff in the 1990s was inspired by the fact that every year you have pilots that land at the wrong airports or get lost flying across the US. And there is a skill that pilots have, and the better they are at it, the less likely they are to get lost flying cross-country. The skill is visual navigation. You look out the cockpit window, you eyeball the terrain, and then you look at a map and you decide if you're in the right place. Now, pilots are not explicitly trained for this skill. They develop it over time through experience. To test the visual navigation skills of experienced pilots, Kelman showed them 20 seconds of video taken from an airplane cockpit, and then showed them a map with 3 locations marked on it, one of which matched the video that they had just been shown. The pilots spent an average of 30 seconds making their choice, and they chose the correct location about 50% of the time. In other words, they may learn this through experience. They don't necessarily always learn it particularly well. Kelman's team then put each pilot through 3 hours worth of perceptual training. He repeated these short interactive trials, 20 seconds of video, 3 locations on a map. And by the end of the 3 hours, the pilots were getting the right answer about 80% of the time, and they were spending less than 15 seconds making their choice. In an interesting twist, Kelman also ran the experiment with non-pilots. And after 3 hours of perceptual training, the non-pilots got to 60% accuracy, and a reaction time below 20 seconds. In other words, non-pilots with 3 hours of explicit perceptual training were outperforming pilots with 2,500 hours of flight experience who did not yet have the perceptual training. Another real-world problem that Kelman and his team tackled was teaching fractions to middle schoolers. Now, we don't really give students a good mental model for how fractions work and why they work, and kids often just accept that there are rules, they seem arbitrary, and when faced with a problem, they'll kind of pick one at random and hope that it applies. And Kelman's work wasn't actually directly aimed at teaching students how to solve fraction problems. Instead, the goal was to get them to recognize the shape of 2 specific types of fraction problems. Is it giving them the whole and asking them to find the part, or is it giving them a part and asking them to find a whole? And he designed interactive trials using problem formulations in multiple representations. So the student's task was to recognize which of 3 problems in one type of representation matched the original problem statement in some other representation. And it was wildly effective. Even though the training didn't address solving actual fraction problems, the students' problem-solving scores soared from 40% in the pre-trial tests to 70% after the training. And when the students were tested several months later, the scores held. This learning was permanent. Over the course of months and years, our brains sort through the noise, identifying the signal. And gradually, our instincts grow. Dr. Kelman's work shows that not only is it possible to take this haphazard process and make it deliberate, but in doing so, we can compress the learning that happens naturally into a much shorter amount of time. And the question that keeps me up at night is how all of this applies to programming. What is it that programmers with some particular expertise perceive that those without it don't? A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post. It was inspired by a tweet that a friend of mine wrote, and before posting it, I showed him the code example, and he was like, nice, I like it. You have a race condition on line 26. Right, some people just notice problems at a glance, but it goes much deeper than that. For example, when reviewing code, the types of problems that people notice seem to be correlated with their degree of expertise in certain areas. People with less expertise tend to point out more low-level, nitpicky, standalone problems, and people with more expertise tend to focus on problems that aren't necessarily in the code in front of them, but in the system as a whole. I saw an example recently where someone was adding a caching library to an open source code base, and one reviewer pointed out a confusing variable name, and another reviewer asked, what metrics showed that adding caching here would even solve the problem? At GitHub, we have a very, very big REST API, hundreds of endpoints, and it has extraordinarily complex authorization logic. You can authorize in many, many different ways, in many, many different contexts, so many circumstances. And crucially, we do not want to leak private data. So we have about 1,000 integration tests that are specifically testing authorization logic in the API layer. And at one point, I noticed that these tests were making 2,500 database calls each. Now, our continuous integration setup has a time budget, and these tests were regularly hitting that budget, causing CI to time out, which meant rerunning the entire test suite, which obviously takes twice as long. And this is bad enough under normal circumstances, but during deploys, this was particularly painful. It slowed things down tremendously. So I submitted a patch to a test helper for this part of the code base that reduced the database calls in these tests by about 40%, which when you think about it is still really bad. But at least the tests were mostly not hitting the time budget on CI anymore. And my manager joked that I'd earned my whole year's salary in that one pull request. But the thing is, I wasn't being a 10x engineer. I wasn't particularly smart. This was pure dumb luck. I had stumbled across this thing with the 2,500 database calls purely by accident while I was chasing down some completely unrelated problem. I have no wizardry when it comes to troubleshooting performance problems. Like, people who are really good, they seem to know instinctively what tools to reach for, where to apply them, when to apply them. They'll eyeball a morass of data, thousands of lines of a profile or report, and they'll point to one number and say, that number seems suspiciously high. How do they know? It's impossible to say, they just do. And one thing that I'm not too bad at is refactoring. I do a lot of refactoring. I think every technical talk I've done in the past 7 years has been about refactoring in some way or another. So there's clearly a lot about refactoring that I can explain. But people invariably ask me, how do you know where to begin? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't feel like I know where to begin. I just kind of look around and then I pick a place. And that seems to work out a lot of the time. About a year ago, a colleague and I were wrestling with a bug. It was the most maddening thing. It was consistently reproducible in production. It was not at all reproducible in development. And we narrowed it down. A particular type of record kept getting saved with the wrong value in a foreign key field. And we were a bit suspicious of the many, many layers of indirection and metaprogramming between us and the database because we could confirm that we were setting the right value on our object right before we saved it, but when it came back out of the database a moment later, it pointed to something else, a completely unrelated thing. Always the same unrelated thing. And we were completely stumped. How is this unrelated thing getting involved? It made no sense. And in desperation, we started walking other colleagues through this problem. And one of our colleagues was like, wait, what's the ID of that unrelated thing? And so we showed him. There was a moment of silence, and he was like, I recognize that number. I was like, of course he does. That's MySQL's max int. We had mistakenly defined our foreign key column as an int, and it should have been a big int, and in less than 3 seconds, our problem went from being incomprehensible to being forehead-slappingly obvious. In production, the table that the foreign key points to has billions of records. Of course the value would get truncated. Of course we would never trigger this in development. The turning point in almost any debugging story is not that someone sees what the problem is. No, they see a thing which reminds them of something that they happen to know, and then they pose the right hypothesis, which leads them to try the right experiment from which they determine what's going on, and something triggers their spidey sense. A few years ago, I had a conversation with Sandy Metz, the author of Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. I had been obsessing over an exercise that asks people to generate the 99 Bottles of Beer song, which is deceptively simple. It has just enough algorithmic complexity to get you into a whole world of trouble. And I complained to Sandy that every single solution I had seen was basically terrible. I mean, they worked, they were fun, they solved the problem, but everyone seemed to be contorting the complexity in some way. And I told her I despaired of seeing a truly good solution, and I wasn't even sure there was one. And she came back a few days later with not one, but 4 perfectly decent solutions. And one of them, in particular, had an abstraction that didn't hide the complexity, but made it go away. And I asked her, how did you know? And she was like, it was obvious. And it took us 3 years to reverse engineer that instinct into a book that breaks it down into explainable concepts. Now, a lot of programming does have to do with explainable concepts, with knowing facts and being able to explicitly verbalize ideas and execute specific sequences of steps. But a huge amount of programming expertise seems to be rooted in perception. It relies on this gut sense, this ability to make snap judgments, to just know. So in a fit of optimism, I have put together an amateur's guide to designing perceptual learning training materials. It's based on Kelman's work. The basic component is the brief classification episode. And by brief, I don't mean instantaneous. If you can puzzle something out logically and deliberately, then go ahead and give your brain the time to do so. If not, that's fine, just guess. Your brain will figure it out. Now, it's crucial that the learner make active judgments. Showing someone something and then telling them the answer usually is not much use here. When they have made their determination, give them explicit feedback. And that's basically it, but for this to actually work, you need a really good data set. It needs to have a huge number of examples with absolutely no duplicates. The brain needs a massive amount of complex variation, and this variation should be not just the relevant features. You want to vary all of the irrelevant characteristics. The brain will detect the underlying invariance, the parts that don't change. That's the whole point of the exercise. And you need all that noise. You need those distractors. Otherwise, the brain has no way of figuring out which distinctions are actually meaningful. And it'll start assigning meaning to certain irrelevant characteristics that just happen to not vary enough in that specific data set, which is how we teach our brains to be biased. So that's the idea: short interactive trials, targeting a specific perceptual skill, using a huge, messy, complex data set with known answers. So, if we want to apply this to the craft of programming, we need to identify the target skills to train. And there seem to be 2 approaches to doing this. One is to identify a small, unambiguous taxonomy. Is the day-old chick male or is it female? Is the fraction problem asking to find the whole or find the part? Is the baby fussing because she's hungry or because she's tired? Is the data structure valid syntax or invalid syntax? Here, we're letting the brain discover for itself which diagnostic features are relevant and how they relate to this taxonomy. The other approach is to find a skill that consists of a well-defined activity, such as the visual navigation that pilots do. They eyeball the terrain, identify the matching location on a map. There is a taxonomy of sorts somewhere, but it is very complex, and it's not explicitly defined anywhere. The brain is left to its own devices to decide both which dimensions matter and how to categorize them. Now, once you understand the fundamental distinction that you're targeting, the problem is reduced to generating or curating a data set. There is some napkin math floating around that suggests that for the past 40 or so years, the number of programmers in the world has doubled every 5 years. Another way of expressing this is that at any one time, 50% of all programmers have less than 5 years of experience. Right. Now, over the course of 10 or 15 years, many of them will acquire some perceptual expertise in some areas, more likely than not. But you can imagine that a huge proportion of these developers will rarely be exposed to the good patterns, the useful distinctions. The signal might forever be drowned out by the noise. Their brains won't stand a chance. And we can do better. We can deliberately compress these lessons, allowing new developers to waste less of their time wrestling with the mechanics of programming and more of their time solving meaningful problems. Thank you.